This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to showcase the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a token commander deck with Brenard Ginger Sculptor as the general. Brenard Ginger Sculptor debuted in Wilds of Eldraine and is a 3/3 human artificer for 1 in Bant colors. That's 1 green, 1 white, and 1 blue mana. Each creature we control that's a food or a golem gets +2/+2 and has trample. Whenever another non-token creature we control dies, we may exile it. If we do, then Brenard creates a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 food golem artifact creature in addition to its other types, and it has pay 2 generic mana, tap and sacrifice this artifact to gain 3 life. Brenard's Anthem effect and Trample enablement make him a powerful food and golem lord, and his creature token producing ability provides a steady stream of synergistic and commander-friendly creatures. The core of this build is sculpted to take advantage of Brenard's abilities by providing additional token and artifact synergies, as well as specific tribal enhancements. As we create waves upon waves of token creatures, which will receive Brenard's power and toughness boosts, as well as his trample enablement, we will outvalue and overwhelm our opponents on the path to imminent victory. As we begin filling the core of this build, let's remain mindful that Brenard buffs food and golem creatures, and creates token copies of non-token creatures when they die. Note that any enter the battlefield abilities of the copied creatures will trigger when the token comes into play this way. With that in mind, our first group of creatures synergize with both of Brenard's abilities quite well. Although Wing Splicer, Blade Splicer, Sensor Splicer, and Master Splicer are not golems, they create 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens when they enter the battlefield. They also respectively give golems we control flying, first strike, vigilance, and +1/+1. When these splicers die, Brenard creates token copies of them as 1/1 food golem artifact creatures. When they come into play, their enter the battlefield triggers trigger, and we create more 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens. Note that these token copies of the splicers are also food golems, and they will grant their keyword enablement and power and toughness boosts to themselves and each other. Golem Tribal is now a thing, thanks to Brenard. Iktekik, Salvage Splicer, and Vital Splicer also create 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens when they enter the battlefield. Whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, Iktekik puts a +1/+1 counter on itself and a +1/+1 counter on each golem we control. This +1/+1 counter delivery system can get out of hand very quickly in this build. Vital Splicer allows us to pay 1 generic mana to regenerate target golem we control. For increased token production, Maul Splicer creates 2 of the aforementioned Phyrexian Golem tokens when it enters the battlefield, and it gives golems we control trample. At the beginning of our end step, if at least 3 artifacts entered the battlefield under our control this turn, then Malcator, Purity Overseer, creates a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. Malcator also creates one of these tokens when it comes into play. Whenever Darksteel Splicer or another non-token Phyrexian enters the battlefield under our control, we create X 3/3 Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens, where X is the number of opponents we have. Darksteel Splicer also gives golem creatures we control indestructible. Note that each of the aforementioned splicers, as well as Malcator, are Phyrexians and will trigger Darksteel Splicer's ability when they enter the battlefield, as long as they are not tokens, of course. For some non-token golem creatures, we have Geode Golem and Meteor Golem. Geode Golem is a 5/3 with trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we may cast Brenard from the command zone without paying his mana cost. Note that we have to pay any commander tax accrued on Brenard when we cast him from the command zone, including through Geode Golem's ability. For a little opponent interaction, when Meteor Golem enters the battlefield, we destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. We can cast Rootwire Amalgam for 5 generic mana as a 5/5, or we can pay the prototype cost of 1 and 1 green mana, and instead it enters the battlefield as a 2/3. Either way, we can pay 3 and 2 green mana and sacrifice Rootwire Amalgam to create a colorless XX Golem artifact creature token, where X is 3 times Rootwire Amalgam's power. It gains haste until end of turn, and we can only activate this ability as a sorcery. With various ways to boost the power and toughness of our golems, in addition to numerous yet-to-be-revealed token multipliers, Rootwire Amalgam could cause a lot of headaches for our opponents and could be considered a win condition in this build. For some peripheral resource development from our golems, when Solemn Simulacrum enters the battlefield, we search our library for a basic land card and put it into play tapped, and when it dies, we draw a card. Golden Guardian also has a death trigger. We can pay 2 generic mana and have it fight another target creature we control. When Golden Guardian dies this turn, we return it to the battlefield transformed as Goldforge Garrison, a land that can tap to add 2 mana of any one color to our mana pool. Note that we do not take damage from this ability or need a particular number of lands to activate it. We also can pay 4 generic mana and tap it to create a 4/4 colorless Golem artifact creature token. For even more impactful death triggers, Triplicate Titan and Phyrexian Triniform are 9/9s that create 3 Golem artifact creature tokens when they die. For the Titan's tokens, one has Flying, one has Vigilance, and the last one has Trample. The Triniform's tokens are Phyrexian Golems, and the Triniform itself has Encore, which means that we can pay its Encore cost and exile it from our graveyard. For each opponent, we create a token that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, and we sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. We can only activate this Encore ability as a sorcery. Note that when these token copies are sacrificed, each one will create 3 3/3 Phyrexian Golem artifact creature tokens. Encoring the Triniform can create an army of golems for the investment of 12 mana. Remember, Brenard's first ability gives each creature we control that's a food or a golem +2/+2 and trample. Although Brenard's second ability creates food golem artifact creature tokens, let's include some artifact creatures that have the food subtype as well. Note that food is an artifact type. Even though it appears on some creatures, it is never a creature type. Let's begin with Sir Ginger the Meal Ender. If an opponent controls a Planeswalker, then it has Trample, Hexproof, and Haste. Whenever another artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on Sir Ginger, and we scry 1. We also can pay 2 generic mana, tap and sacrifice Sir Ginger to gain life equal to its power. Note that we put a +1/+1 counter onto the Meal Ender and scry 1 whenever any artifact is put into any graveyard from the battlefield. We are not the only player at the table that can trigger Sir Ginger. Tough Cookie and Ginger Brute are food golems. Tough Cookie creates a food token when it enters the battlefield. We can also pay 2 and a green mana to have target non-creature artifact we control become a 4/4 artifact creature until end of turn. Note that we do not have to tap Tough Cookie in order to activate its ability, which means that we can activate it multiple times in a turn or a round of turns. Here we can temporarily turn our foods into 4/4 creatures. Ginger Brute has haste, and we can pay 1 generic mana to prevent any creatures without haste from blocking it this turn. We can also pay 2 generic mana, tap and sacrifice these creatures to gain 3 life. Remember, they are foods. Now let's showcase some food synergies. At the beginning of combat on our turn, Sam, Loyal Attendant, creates a food token. Sam also reduces the cost of activated abilities of foods we control by 1 generic mana, down from 2 generic mana to just 1. When Eleanor Gardner and Provisions Merchant enter the battlefield, we create a food token. At the beginning of our end step, if we sacrificed a food this turn, Eleanor allows us the option of searching our library for a basic land card and putting it into play tapped. Whenever Provisions Merchant attacks, we may sacrifice a food, and if we do, then attacking creatures get +1/+1 and gain Trample until end of turn. When the Goose Mother enters the battlefield, it does so with X +1/+1 counters on it, and we create half-X food tokens rounded up. Whenever the Goose Mother attacks, we may sacrifice a food. If we do, then we draw a card. This bird hydra's evasiveness will serve us well, as we should be able to draw numerous cards throughout the game by sending it into combat. Banquet Guests has affinity for food, which means that it costs 1 generic mana less to cast for each food we control. It has Trample, and it enters the battlefield with twice X +1/+1 counters on it. We can pay 2 generic mana and sacrifice a food to make Banquet Guests indestructible until end of turn. We have the potential to one-shot an opponent with Banquet Guests in this build. When Knight of the Sweet's Revenge enters the battlefield, we create a food token. We can pay 5 and 2 green mana and sacrifice this enchantment to give creatures we control +X until end of turn, where X is the number of foods we control. We can only activate this ability as a sorcery. We can consider this enchantment's sacrifice ability a win condition here. So far, the focus of our build has been centered on golems and foods, both of which are artifacts. Since we have a strong presence of artifacts here, let's add some artifact synergies for the purposes of enhancing our theme. For the sake of protection, we have Bronze Guardian and Lashiel, Clockwork Scholar. Bronze Guardian's power is equal to the number of artifacts we control. It has Double Strike, Ward 2, and gives other artifacts we control Ward 2. Whenever an opponent targets a permanent we control that has Ward 2 with a spell or an ability they control, it is countered unless that player pays 2 generic mana. Bronze Guardian's power could be massive in this build, and with Double Strike, it is a major threat to our opponents. Even more so considering that the Guardian is a golem, so it receives all of the keyword enablement and power and toughness boost showcased throughout this video. Lashiel, an Elephant Artificer, prevents all combat damage that will be dealt to attacking artifact creatures we control, and whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under our control, we draw a card. Although this ability only triggers once per turn, we should be able to trigger it numerous times throughout the game. For battlefield enhancement, Tempered Steel and Urza, Prince of Krug, give artifact creatures we control +2/+2. We can also pay 6 generic mana to have Urza create a token that's a copy of target artifact we control, except it's a 1/1 soldier creature in addition to its other types. Any of the artifact creatures featured in this build are fine targets for Urza's ability, even at the somewhat hefty price tag of 6 generic mana. For resource development, we have another Urza. This time, it's Urza, Lord High Artificer. He allows us to tap an untapped artifact we control to add a blue mana to our mana pool. When Urza enters the battlefield, we create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token that gets +1/+1 for each artifact we control. If these abilities weren't enough, we can also pay 5 generic mana to shuffle our library and then exile the top card of it. Until end of turn, we may play that card without paying its mana cost. With the ability to generate oodles of mana in this build, Urza can completely take over a game. Shimmer Dragon has hexproof as long as we control at least 4 artifacts, and we can tap 2 untapped artifacts we control to draw a card. Since this build leans so heavily into artifacts, Urza and Shimmer Dragon provide game-altering value. For additional win conditions, we have Cyberdrive Awakener and Rise and Shine. When the Awakener enters the battlefield, until end of turn, each non-creature artifact we control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness of 4/4. Cyberdrive Awakener has flying, and also gives other artifact creatures we control flying as well. If we pay the overload cost for Rise and Shine, then each non-creature artifact we control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. We put 4 +1/+1 counters on each artifact that became a creature this way. Since these cards interact with non-creature artifacts, we can utilize our food tokens as creatures and send them into game-clinching combat. Alongside artifacts, we have a strong token presence in this build secondary to our golems and foods. Enhancing this token theme makes our side of the battlefield even more threatening. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, Tireless Provisioner creates either a food token or a treasure token. We can tap and sacrifice a treasure to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Or we can use Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, instead. She allows us to tap tokens we control to add green mana to our mana pool. If 1 or more tokens would be created under our control, Peregrine Took has those tokens and an additional food token created instead. Whenever we create a token, Rosie Cotton of South Lane puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control other than herself. We also create a food token whenever she enters the battlefield. If we were to create a clue, food, or treasure token, Academy Manufacturer creates one of each instead. For a clue token, we can pay 2 generic mana and sacrifice it to draw a card. If one or more tokens would be created under our control, then Parallel Lives, Anointed Procession, Adrix and Nev, Twin Casters, and Mondrak, Glory Dominus create twice that many of those tokens instead. As enchantments, Parallel Lives and Anointed Procession have staying power on the battlefield. Adrix and Nev has protection in the form of Ward 2, and we can pay 1 generic mana and 2 white Phyrexian mana and sacrifice 2 other creatures and or artifacts to put an indestructible counter onto Mondrak. The longer these cards remain in play, the higher our chances are of winning the game. Note that white Phyrexian mana can be paid with either a white mana or 2 life. Doubling Season also creates twice the number of tokens, but it also extends its doubling efforts to any counters placed on permanents we control. This is not a dedicated counter build, but we have enough +1/+1 counter abilities to benefit from both of Doubling Season's abilities. The same can be said for Primal Vigor, except its counter doubling effect only applies to +1/+1 counters, and its abilities are global, which means that they are provided to each player at the table. Yes, Primal Vigor has the potential to help our opponents, but it will help us so much more. As a one-and-done effect, for each token we control, Second Harvest creates a token that's a copy of that permanent. Note that this spell is an instant and can be considered a win condition here. Now let's close out this video with a smattering of cards that synergize with and enhance our theme. Since our opponents may not be willing to send our creatures to the graveyard for the purposes of utilizing Brenard's token-producing ability, let's do it ourselves by including some sacrifice outlets in the forms of Witch's Oven, Phyrexian Altar, Ashnod's Altar, and Greater Good. We can tap Witch's Oven and sacrifice a creature to create a food token. If the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, then we create 2 food tokens instead. We can respectively sacrifice a creature to Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar to add 1 mana of any color and 2 colorless mana to our mana pool. Greater Good has us draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then we discard 3 cards. With so many of our creatures sporting Enter the Battlefield abilities, including Panharmonicon, Virtue of Knowledge, and Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, allow us to double up these triggers, much to the chagrin of our opponents. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent we control to trigger, Panharmonicon has that ability trigger an additional time. Virtue of Knowledge and the Mom iteration of Elesh Norn do the same, except the additional trigger happens whenever a permanent enters the battlefield and triggers the ability of a permanent we control, and not just artifacts or creatures like Panharmonicon. The adventure side of Virtue of Knowledge, Vantress Visions, has us copy target activated or triggered ability we control. We may choose new targets for the copy. For the purposes of Elesh-induced Salty Symmetry, permanents entering the battlefield do not cause triggered abilities of permanents our opponents control to trigger. Elesh doubles ours, and our opponents get squatty. The power and toughness of Karn, Legacy Reforged, are each equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts we control. Since Karn's mana value is 5, the floor for his power and toughness is also 5, but its ceiling could be much, much higher. At the beginning of our upkeep, we add a colorless mana to our mana pool for each artifact we control, which is going to be a lot of mana. Until end of turn, we do not lose this mana as steps and phases end, and it can only be spent to cast artifact spells. Note that Karn is a Golem, and will receive all of the Golem-centric enhancements previously showcased during this video. For a couple of more win conditions, when Craterhoof Behemoth and Moonshaker Cavalry enter the battlefield, creatures we control respectively gain Trample and Flying, and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is equal to the number of creatures we control. With a build focused on inundating our side of the battlefield with creature tokens, either of these creatures should end the game upon entering the battlefield. Hopefully, they won't end the relationships of anyone with whom we play Magic. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a token commander deck with Brenard Ginger Sculptor as the general. The cards showcased during this video are suggested options for crafting the thematic core of a token EDH deck, in addition to providing ways of optimizing this theme. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. In building around videos like this one, these deck components are left in the hands of each individual deck brewer. If you found this video appealing, then be sure to check out our other building around videos through the playlist on your screen. Also be sure to check out our other deck building series, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts about the core of this Brenard build in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, a channel for all things magic.